Tal, it's 5 months since the October 7th massacres. How much safer is Israel today than it was on October 6th?
We are much safer today because we're crushing Hamas. We said that we will eliminate their military capabilities, their government bodies, and that at the end of this war, they will no longer have the desire to, and the capabilities, of course, to ever hurt us again as they did on October 7th. And the fact of the matter is that we are making an unprecedented progress in the history of urban modern warfare, in the pace, the scope in which we're taking out their terrorist infrastructure and eliminating the terrorists on the ground, if it's Hamas or Palestinian Islamic Jihad. If you want to talk numbers, then so far we eliminated more than 13,000 Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad terrorists. We apprehended thousands more, injured thousands more, which means they are immobilized one way or another. And we're getting close to this point in which we took out the majority of their military capabilities. More so if you talk about the missile manufacturing capabilities, we took out about 90% of that and their stockpile of missiles, but there's still work to be done. They still have about between 4 and 6, mainly 4 operational battalions in Rafah. This is one of the reasons why we must go in and we must operate there.
How concerned are you about the optics of a major offensive during Ramadan?
So optics and PR is one thing, but I'll just remind your viewers and listeners that, of course, it's great to get international support in a very justified war, and of course, we would rather have good optics, but it's a war, and this is not the case. And we're not going to stop fighting or fight for support for optics. What we're fighting for is to stay alive. It's as simple as that. We faced and we are still facing an existential genocidal threat. It's called Hamas in the south and Hezbollah in the north. The optics are the optics that Hamas wants the world to see. They think that by showing the world that obviously there's destruction in Gaza, but that's a consequence of their decision to wage war against us. It's a consequence of a historical pattern of poor priorities on the Palestinian side, unfortunately. And these optics, if Israel would take the pressure for it, this is exactly what Hamas wants to see. They want to see Israel succumbing to international pressure so that we will take the fire for their vile actions and stop crushing them on the ground, give them impunity. It's not going to happen.
There are still a huge amount of hostages being held by Hamas. We don't know what condition these hostages are in and how healthy they are. There has been no access to them and no concrete intelligence. What is your take on where we are with a potential deal of some kind that would see the return of hostages?
So we want our stolen people back, full stop. They must come back home. They must be reunited with their family. There's no question about it. And we are pursuing both the military avenue and the diplomatic avenue combined to try to bring to the release of more hostages. We had this framework back in November. You and I talked about it. In which we saw the release of more than 100 hostages, and we hope to reach another agreement of this kind. But so far, Hamas have presented delusional demands, delusional terms in the negotiations. That's a word that Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu used to describe these negotiations. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said that they were non-starter demands.
More than 5 months on since Hamas's horrific massacres in southern Israel, a huge amount of hostages remain in their hands. What is the latest on any kind of a deal to see their return?
David, our stolen people must come back home to their families. There's no question here, full stop. And we are working in military ways and also in diplomatic avenues to try to bring to the release of more hostages. We had this framework, as you remember, you reported about this back in November, which saw the release of more than 100 hostages, but we still have 134 hostages held captive there in Gaza for 153 days. For 33 of them, unfortunately, time has run out. They have to come out. We are hearing horrendous accounts from hostages who returned back in November about the hell that they were going through, the hell that our remaining hostages are going through, and especially the young women there. We know for a fact that they are being subject to sexual violence. We know that for a fact. There's even a UN report that came out this week specifying exactly that. So we know that the only thing that works against Hamas is this combination of military pressure and the diplomatic avenue. But in the negotiations so far, I can tell you that Hamas has presented terms that were simply delusional, as Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu called them. And U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, he referred to them as non-starters. And just 2 days ago, President Biden said that Israel has put forward a rational offer. So there you have it. This is where we're standing right now. But we set very clear red lines for any such potential deal that will see the release of hostages. We will not release thousands of Palestinian terrorists in exchange, nor will we agree to withdraw IDF forces from the Gaza Strip entirely, because that would mean, in other words, giving up total victory. We can't allow that.
You mentioned the sexual violence being perpetrated by Hamas against Israeli female hostages. The UN finally brought that to the fore. How disgusted and outraged have you been by the lack of empathy and the lack of acknowledgement that there has been to date regarding sexual violence against female hostages?
Very much. Very outraged. We're right before, International Women's Day. This is outrageous. There's so much disinformation and denial, simply denial going on, especially online when you see it, and it's really Holocaust denial levels, because we have put forward abundant evidence and testimonies of the sexual violence that has taken place. Also on October 7th in various sceneries, various locations, especially around the Nova Music Festival down south near Kibbutz Ra'im. But not only there, also in the kibbutzim. And as you mentioned, the hostages, right now, we know, just a few days ago, I had the honor to speak to one of the hostages, elderly hostages who returned from Gaza after 50 days there in November, Aviva Siegel. And she talked to some of these young women who are still there. She didn't name them, but she knows for a fact that they were touched. They were asked to take showers together in front of the terrorists. It's terrible, it's outrageous. At the same time, it is very important that this UN report finally came out, as you said. Better late than never, I guess. But what's the implication? We want to see the UN Security Council now convening, acknowledging this UN report and condemning Hamas. They must condemn Hamas. The fact that UNR is sitting here 5 months after October 7th and the UN Security Council still hasn't condemned Hamas to date, that's outrageous. It's very telling about the anti-Israel bias, the rot in this institution. It's unbelievable. And how will the terrorists interpret that? As global indifference to sexual violence? The world doesn't care?
Weakness in the UN in that regard, but also there is a growing sentiment that Iran, and particularly the IRGC, needs to be dealt with in a more meaningful way, with the Houthis launching attacks in the Red Sea, Hezbollah and Hamas, as you've mentioned, other issues in Syria and Iraq. How concerned is Israel right now about the overall threat of Iran, a regime that despises Israel and that is trying to create nuclear weapons, a nuclear arsenal?
We are very concerned. We've always been concerned, and what's happening now is also part of this bigger play. We have been dealing with Iranian proxies, if it's Hezbollah, if it's Hamas. Palestinian Islamic Jihad, the second largest terrorist organization in Gaza, is fully funded, supported by Iran. Hamas's 93% of their budget comes from Iran. Same goes for Hezbollah. And the Houthis, now everyone knows that they are a global threat. They should be met with a global response. And we're very appreciative of our international partners in that respect, dealing with the Houthis. But when you look at what Iran has been doing right now across the region, and you think how much more dangerous they can get if they acquire nuclear weapons, I mean, that's unfathomable. We will never allow that to happen. And Israel is, in fact, acting against Iran in various ways on multiple fronts. But we should never allow this to happen. And just to remind you, Iranian weaponry is not only found in Gaza on the ground and up north with Hezbollah, also on European soil. When you look at the war in Ukraine, you find Iranian weaponry there. Wherever there's trouble across the world, bloodshed, you'll find Iran.
So is it not then time to bring the fight to Iran in Iran and have actual targeting of Iranian infrastructure, terrorist infrastructure in that country?
We've been working against Iran in various ways that we shouldn't be discussing, on air, so to say. We have our ways. They know it, and we will deal with them one way or another.
As an Israeli representing Israel abroad, how have you found doing that now that you're here in London and obviously you're backwards and forwards to America? There has been a sadly inevitable rise in anti-Semitism since the October 7th attacks. How have you found representing Israel abroad during that time, and how do you think that has developed in the last months and last weeks?
It's awful. It's unfortunate. Honestly, it breaks my heart to see what Jews worldwide, in Europe, in the US have to deal with. It's all intertwined. But if there's one thing that I can tell you is that, unfortunately, it's not surprising. Not to me, not to many back home, not to many Jews, Jewish communities that I get to speak to. Nobody says it's surprising. These are sentiments that were always there, brewing, and now they're just, emerging and getting amplified also by social media. And there's so many lies out there, so many lies, David. On the positive side of things, it brings us together. We're all connected and we're all united in this fight. And what starts with the Jews never end with the Jews. And I think people are realizing that. It's you see the sentiment of solidarity in Israel, and wherever I go, if it's in the US, and now it's my first time ever in London, but I met with Jewish community representatives, and you get the same feel and the same sentiments, and everyone is getting this. So it sounds a cliche, but when we are united, I know for a fact that we will prevail, because we've been through this so many times throughout history. And we are the same people speaking the same language, sharing a very similar DNA, connected to the same territory of some 3,500 years ago. There's a reason for that, because we get it. We understand what we're up against, and we know what it takes to survive in a very difficult neighborhood. And right now, we say that for our survival, Hamas must be gone.
Israel is used to having the stomach for the fight and the long-term fight. How concerned are you about any support that may be going away from Israel at all, from America and the United Kingdom. Both those countries have elections this year, and so military action in Gaza is likely to become an issue that people think voters are interested in. What concern is there in Israel about support from its closest allies?
So according to polls that I've seen, very encouraging, specifically in the United States, the overwhelming majority of American people support Israel in this war. They want Israel to win. They understand why Israel must win. Because when we eliminate Hamas, our victory does not only serve our interests, it serves the regional interest of the good forces there that want to take our region, forward, not backwards, not the terrorist elements that are the biggest enemies of peace. But a victory of Israel also served Western civilization and just the civilized world, so to say. Because what happens if Israel doesn't win against Hamas? All the terrorists, all the bad players around the world right now are observing what's happening in our region, and they're taking notes. And if they understand that Israel is subject to a lot of global pressure, what's the read? What's the message in it for them? It's an open invitation for more terrorism, more bloodshed. It is an open invitation. This is why we insist that the UN condemns Hamas. Let's see if this happens.
What is the most frustrating part of this for you, beyond the horrors of what happened? What is the most aggravating element of it?
That we didn't have time to mourn.
And what gives you hope?
I think the same. The same answer. That we're so determined, so united, and in this together, and there's just no question about it. We know what we must do. We simply know what must be done, and we know where we're going. We know what we want to achieve. We know what we want to see the day after. We know that we have the goals of this war that we didn't start and didn't want as we set them. We will achieve all of them, which is to bring our hostages back home, to eliminate the Hamas terrorist regime, and make sure that Gaza will never ever pose a terror threat to us again. But we also know that we want to see a better horizon for a better future between us and our Palestinian neighbors. Jewish people have a right to live in their ancestral homeland next to the Palestinians, but it can be, Palestinians' sovereignty aspirations cannot come instead of the state of Israel, as was their demand so far. And I'm full of hope that once we take out the terrorist element, once Palestinians in the region and the world understands that terrorism is simply a dead end and will always be a dead end as long as they keep choosing it, once we have achieved that, I hope that we can begin a serious process of de-radicalization and reconstruction of Gaza that has to be intertwined with de-radicalization of the society and move forward.